Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the American Foreign Policy Council, where we're talking to one of the scholars here, Ilan Berman, who is an expert on all matters Soviet, Middle East, but also on strategy. And I wanted to point out your new book that you edited, The Logic of Irregular War, Asymmetry in America's Adversaries. Ilan, you and I yesterday were at the Heritage Foundation, where there were a lot of Reagan luminaries, and the discussion was about the Strategic Defense Initiative, and it was done to coincide with President Reagan's Star Wars speech, which he made on this very day 35 years ago, March 23, 1983, where he laid out a vision that was driven by President Reagan's sense of the immorality of the mutual assured destruction thinking, that the United States needed to have another option aside from both nations going to war. The United States should build a space-based Star Wars defense system. Talk to us about what some of the drivers then were. And, Ambassador Hank Cooper was there, who's the High Frontier Foundation, Attorney General Ed Meese was there, Sven Kramer was there, some of the core Reagan team that actually believed in so strongly in SDI. And the message from that group was how applicable it is today. Talk to us, wind the clock back and talk to us a little bit in 1983, what the thinking then was, the strategic thinking was, and how relevant is it today?
Right. So I think that's sort of the central question, because SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, was really intended to be a response to a mismatch of objectives that animated what was then known as the balance of terror. The Soviet Union was very interested in pursuing counter-value strategy to target things like the American citizen that the United States really cared about. The United States wasn't focusing on Soviet population centers. It was focusing on counterforce, essentially targeting elements of the strategic arsenal of the Soviet Union that it could hold at risk.
Legitimate military targets is how we would look at it.
Correct. And so that mismatch is what created the balance of terror. The knowledge that the Soviet leadership had, sort of with one potential, flip of the switch or push of the button, had the potential to really sort of alter irrevocably the American way of life. President Reagan understood this. He took a look at the capabilities that were then coming online, which is sort of, I think, a separate conversation, because it's useful to point out that every technology that we're talking about with regard to missile defense, we're innovating, but they're not new. This is a conversation we were having 35 years ago. Took a look at the potential for invalidating that counter-value proposition altogether. And the best way that President Reagan thought he could do that was by creating a system that would comprehensively target the ballistic missiles of an adversary like the Soviet Union, or potentially like Communist China, in all phases of flight. In the boost phase, when the missile is slow and hot; in mid-course, when the missile is, if it's an ICBM, is sort of entering the exoatmosphere; and the terminal phase, when it's hot and fast and it's moving towards the target very quickly. This is the building block, the theoretical building block, on which we've since built that system of systems that President Bush really sort of brought into fruition during his 2 terms in office. But that core vision, the core vision of comprehensive defense, was really something that was championed by President Reagan, and it's something that we've really walked backwards from since then. You and I both had parents that were born in the Soviet Union. Mine in Soviet Armenia. Yours were Jewish refugees, refuseniks that emigrated from the Soviet Union. You were born in Israel on the way over to the United States. Talk to us a little bit about the relevance, because your talk yesterday was focused on Iran, the Iranian threat, but also looking at North Korea and the challenges that it poses. What are the elements of SDI? There are very, very passionate believers in sort of the giant space-based architecture that some people said was prohibitively expensive even at the time, or whether that it was even achievable. But what are the elements from your standpoint, given the kind of threats the nation does face? If North Korean negotiations, for example, fail and the Iranian nuclear deal fails to be that deterrent that everybody had hoped it would be, what are the elements of SDI that you think are most applicable today in sort of a bigger missile, space-based
but also ground-based missile defense system.
Right. No, and I think that's really the point, which is that we're marking a historical milestone, but there's all sorts of contemporary relevance to what we're talking about with regard to missile threats internationally now. The top of mind is Iran. We are now moving into a political cycle where it looks increasingly likely that the Iran nuclear deal is not going to stand beyond late spring. President Trump has signaled that he's interested in nixing it unless there are sufficient fixes, but he's been, I think, intentionally vague on articulating what those fixes actually have to be. One of them that he has talked about is a framework to mitigate against Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, which the Iranians have refused out of hand. So this tees up a very interesting conversation about what happens after the nuclear deal, if the 2015 deal is really going to go away.
And I think that at this point, with John Bolton coming in, H.R. McMaster leaving, Tillerson's gone, Pompeo is in. If you look at all the dynamics on that and the elevation of some folks within the National Security Council who are all, opposed to the deal. I'm not even going to say skeptics, but are flat out opposed to the deal.
That's right. No, I think that's right. And so the betting money is on the deal going away. But what we really haven't had a fulsome conversation about is what comes next. How do you curtail an expansionist Iran that has reaped the economic dividends of this 2015 agreement? How do you put Iran back in a box? What capabilities do you need to bring online in order to do that? And that is not totally, but at least in part, a missile defense conversation. It's a conversation about which capabilities we have in theater, which capabilities we'd like to bring online to do assurance for our allies like Israel, allies like the Gulf states, also to do deterrence against the Iranian regime, to essentially invalidate this growing ballistic missile arsenal that they have. And this is more or less, there's some differences, but this is more or less the paradigm that also applies in North Korea. President Trump, sort of not totally disconnectedly, is going to be having a very similar conversation with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in May, right after he makes that decision about the Iran nuclear deal. The more leverage he has at the table when he talks to Kim Jong-un about changing North Korea's belligerent attitude, about capabilities that the U.S. has to protect its allies in the Asian theater, this is all, I think, very germane. So the crux of my remarks yesterday were oriented around the idea that this notion of comprehensive defense, which is something that's really fallen by the wayside as we've sort of developed and spun out our system of systems, is really something that's long overdue for a revisit. And it's not clear that space is the answer for everything. The space-based architecture, even as articulated by the Reagan administration late in its tenure and by the Bush 1 administration during its one term in office, was prohibitively expensive. But nonetheless, more and more investments in the types of basing modes that make us able to get out of this race of capabilities with rogues like North Korea and rogues like Iran becomes very important when you start thinking about the strategic doctrine that animates the Ayatollahs in Tehran or the Kim dynasty in Pyongyang.
There are those, however, who will say, when you talk to all the folks who are negotiating the deal, we're saying, look, this isn't aimed at their conventional ballistic arsenal. It's to forestall a nuclear program that would be the casus belli for folks in the region. Let's try to fence that. And if you could look at some of the demonstrations that happened, there are those who argue that actually those giant street demonstrations were fed by Iranians who were saying, hey, wait a minute, we're getting money, we're getting some windfalls here, we're not seeing any of that money, our lot's not changing at all, we want you Ayatollahs to change our lot. So in the event that the deal goes away, right, so what do you say to that logic? But the second piece is, what happens with our allies? Because our allies are looking at the combination of tariffs, steel and aluminum tariffs, fears of a trade war, this issue on top of that, would drive a rift between the United States. And can the United States get to a better deal with Iran if it doesn't have its allies that are alongside it?
Right. So the core problem, I think, of the dilemma that we find ourselves in with Iran is that we were sort of sold on the merits of the Iran deal derivatively. Right. We were posited with a false choice, which was that it's either a nuclear deal, a nuclear agreement with Iran, or it's a conflict with Iran. And nobody wants a conflict with Iran, clearly. But there has been a tremendous amount of shift in the global balance of power and the regional balance of power in the Middle East as a result of the deal, right? Iran is very charitably, it's on the march, it is acting more and more aggressively in its immediate neighborhood, and it's acquiring capabilities to act more and more aggressively globally. So the Trump administration's Iran strategy, which is still in formation, despite the fact that in October they announced that they had a comprehensive strategy, I think it's fair to say it's still a work in progress, is really oriented around two things. One is what to do with the Iran nuclear deal. Now that a significant portion of the dividends have already been conferred, what do you do with the deal? Do you keep the agreement? Can you still constrain Iranian behavior by staying within the four corners of the agreement? Or do you really need to remove it? But the other part, and this is, I would argue, the harder part, is what to do with an emboldened Iran. Right? And that's a conversation about containment, that's a conversation about capabilities, including missile defense, that you can bring to bear in order to maintain the regional status quo against a revisionist Iran, right? They're connected conversations, but they're separate conversations, and they're intimately related to one another in the sense that a Trump administration that keeps the integrity of the deal sets the stage for, yes, a coalition of international partners, including in Europe, that are willing up to a point to sort of to police the cordon and to really sort of impose the restraints and constrictions that are inherent in the deal. But nonetheless, it does raise a question about whether or not this temporary fix, because after all, the nuclear deal is temporary, is sufficient for the Trump administration to be comfortable with using it as a fix for an increasingly emboldened, increasingly capable Iran. My sense is, because personnel is policy, sort of the pendulum is swinging very decisively in the direction of an exceedingly skeptical view of the Iran nuclear deal. So that second conversation about what to do about Iran and how do you marshal your allies in order to help you do that becomes really where the rubber meets the road.
But our allies have said that they're not willing to entertain a renegotiation of the deal. They've sort of paid lip service to the fact that we're willing to discuss toughening it, but on the other hand, there hasn't, so what's the way around it? Because although there are still constraints on Iran, right? I mean, they haven't been confirmed all the benefits of it. Some of the money, I think, is still in escrow and hasn't been released to the Iranians. So, you could look at this as they've gotten the money. They haven't yet gotten all the money, which is, part of the sword that's hanging over them, and why the sort of constant every 6 months the nuclear certification is an important thing to do, which is why all eyes are on the president. But when that goes away, right, every action has an equal and opposite reaction to it. And there are a lot of people who, if I'm Benjamin Netanyahu and I'm looking at indictments, a war with Iran might be a very positive thing. Similarly, the rhetoric from a lot of the Gulf states has been extremely muscular as well, hence, the alliance actually that exists with Israel and the nations in the region, with the exception of Qatar. Talk to us about that dimension. What happens when allies don't go along with us, and what are the levers to actually try to make this happen? Because this can only be successful if, is the United States, for example, going to start sanctioning British and French companies that do business in Iran?
No, I think that's really a very important part of the conversation, because the reality is that Iran has received some of the benefit, some of that money that was previously in escrow, Iran has access to, but it hasn't really used yet. Which is why former Secretary of State John Kerry can get away with saying that Iran hasn't really seen a lot of the economic windfall. Well, the reality is Iran can access it anytime they want. So it's a little bit of a straw man, but you're absolutely right in the sense that Iran is still operating in an economically constrained environment, in part because U.S. partners abroad, in places like Germany, in places like the UK, haven't gone all in terms of economic investment because they're worried about the durability of the deal. They're worried about the Trump administration moving away from the deal. This, I suspect, makes them a little bit more pliable than they're publicly saying about renegotiating the deal, about sort of tweaking it to strengthen it. If there is a middle ground to be had with the White House, and that's really, I think, not clear. It's not clear to me that the new team, and it's ever changing, ever evolving, but there is a new team that's coalescing around President Trump, is willing to do that, is willing to fix the deal and keep it in more or less its current form. There are clear downsides to moving beyond the JCPOA, including the possibility that Iran, which is already regionally emboldened, we remove even the nominal constraints, and you make the likelihood of an Iranian-Israeli conflict more likely, for example. But I would argue that this is not monocausal. It's not just the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal remaining doesn't mean Israel and Iran will go to war, or won't go to war. the deal disappearing doesn't mean Israel and Iran will go to war. In fact, a lot of what Iran is doing in Syria, for example, has nothing to do with the nuclear deal, and yet that is most likely the principal driver, if there is a conflict, of what will happen between Israel and the Iranians. So the larger paradigm that the Trump administration needs to confront is, as a result in part of the nuclear deal, that Iran is flexing its muscles regionally. And there are many different ways that we can begin to tackle that. The real operative question, though, is whether or not the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal, helps us or hinders us from doing so.
What about Iran's breakout capability? I mean, part of the whole rationale for the agreement, or one important rationale for it, was they were very, very close to developing nuclear weapons. Now the international community is there. By all accounts, the certification authorities are saying, you know, that the Iranians are very much behaving themselves and living up to their side of the agreement. You know, what about that? Because that's, you know, once the deal breaks apart, they can kick everybody out, unless you coordinate an immediate strike on them, right?
No, that's right.
And generally, no nation, you know, as a student of history, no nation has been deterred from developing nuclear weapons if they wanted nuclear weapons.
That's right.
So, you know, ultimately, you know, everybody falls within mad doctrine, whether people like it or not. You know, what about that element of it? And then I want to ask you about, we to move on to our next popular topic, which is Russia.
Okay, good. Well, no, so that the breakout capability is a question, and it was in fact the driving motivation for the Obama administration, or at least one of them for the Obama administration to to engage in the negotiating process in the first place. The problem is that that's a very legitimate concern, but the constraints that are presented in the JCPOA are not sufficient to prevent a credible Iranian nuclear breakout. In fact, because of the sunset clauses that are built into the agreement, because the agreement deals with Iran's domestic production, doesn't really take a look at Iranian procurement from places like North Korea, you've actually made the process more opaque. We have less confidence in our estimates of what Iran's nuclear breakout capability is now than we did 2 or 3 years ago, because Iran is incentivized to cheat and retreat and to do all these different things that make it harder for us to gauge this. So this is a valid concern, but I would argue that this is probably a concern that, if you look closely at the four corners of the agreement, it's one that's really not being satisfied.
And you don't put any stock to social change in Iran, because you see that much more frequently now there are whole social movements, you know, women's movements. There are women who are taking their chadors off and saying, like, hey, you know, we don't want to do that. That puts pressure on the Ayatollahs. You know, the dynamic is changing. There's a very young population. They have a little bit of a problem that Mohammed bin Salman is trying to deal with in Saudi Arabia, which is, I've got older, much more conservative people, but I have a whole bunch of younger people who are, you know, don't even remember the revolution, for example. And you know, if you poll them, the Ayatollahs are not that popular. How much stock do you put in this? We were shooting for this window in which the nation changes, hopefully, and decides that, you know, these are not the courses we want to be on.
Well, that was, I think, part of the driver of the rationale behind the nuclear deal in the first place. It was to create the conditions to lessen tensions such that behavior modification becomes possible within the Islamic Republic. But what we've seen over the last 3 years since the signing, 2.5 years since the signing of the agreement, is that this may be true on a grassroots level. There is a lot of ferment taking place within Iran. Iran is a uniformly young population. This is not the case with regard to the regime. So this is a regime that historically has preferred guns over butter, has prioritized military development and military spending over social programs. And that tendency hasn't been reversed. It's actually been strengthened as a result of the nuclear deal. Iran's military modernization efforts, Iran's investments in its ballistic missiles have all actually accelerated since the signing of the deal. This has caused discontent on the Iranian street, as we saw earlier this year. But whether or not this is the straw that breaks the camel's back, I don't think that's clear at all. And in the meantime, we're left with a very repressive regime that is not only a danger to its own population, which it clearly is, but is increasingly capable to be a danger regionally.
Let's talk a little bit about the Soviets very briefly, although I'd love to have a longer conversation with you on this. You know, we really have had, you know, as your book points out, almost every nation is grasping for asymmetric means. Russia is bolstering its military capability, but its ability to disrupt elections in the United States and perhaps determine outcomes. That happened in Brexit. If you talk to British officials, they know full well the extent of Russian activity. They didn't want to scare the electorate and talking to the population honestly about it. France looks like it geared up very quickly to stop what could have been something that could have changed the election outcome. And we've seen that sort of cyber meddling all across the region, sometimes with Russians helping countries and leaders that they may not necessarily agree with simply to undermine, for example, the EU and NATO. And we just saw a nerve agent, Novichok, used against a Skripal couple. What's the right way for the international community to be responding to a Russia that is not abiding by any international rule, and that this is the latest episode in a campaign against the West? These aren't isolated efforts. They're almost battles in a wider campaign plan. What's the way for the international community to respond? And can it respond without the White House really putting its full shoulder behind a response?
So the answer to the second question is very clearly no. And I frankly think that this is a huge missed opportunity. I think it's clear that the Russians meddled in the U.S. elections. I also think it's equally clear that this is not a unique condition. The Russians have been meddling in the French elections, in the German elections, in the British elections. The goal here is not to pick and choose candidates. The goal here is to undermine confidence in democratic and transparent, pluralistic institutions. That suggests that the response isn't an American response, it's an alliance response. And the dog that really is embarking in this conversation is how much leadership potential there is at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to actually say this and say the Russians are waging an asymmetric war of influence. Their goal is to degrade the confidence of our citizenry, but it's also to essentially paralyze the Western alliance and to not have NATO and Europe move resolutely when they make moves on territories like Ukraine. The more we contextualize it in that fashion, the more we try to explain it as a Russian effort to revise in their favor the post-Cold War balance of power in Europe, I think the more solid ground we'll be on in terms of crafting a response that isn't just American, it's not just knee-jerk, it's not just political, but it's really a strategic response that binds together the U.S. with its NATO partners.
And what about, do you think it's an Article 5 event? I mean, we saw Litvinenko was the first time a radiological agent was used by a foreign state in a foreign country that we know of, right, that was verifiable. And this is the first time a nerve agent has been used in Europe since a world war.
No, I think it's right. This is clearly a very dangerous development, all the more so if it doesn't precipitate a resolute response, because you can sort of see the messaging coming out of the Kremlin already. Well, maybe it was this faction, maybe it was this faction, nobody quite knows. The goal here is not to absolve Russia entirely of culpability, because everybody who's in the know sort of understands the score. What it is doing is to try to inject enough doubt in Western decision-making that there isn't resolute action that punishes the Russians. And this is the same model that we saw with the downing of the MH17 airliner over Ukraine. It's the same model that we see with regard to Russian pleas of innocence with regard to election meddling. This is all of a piece of Russia trying to asymmetrically erode the confidence and the cohesion of the West. I think it should be responded to as such, right? It's very easy to fall into this this notion that this is a bilateral affair. The Russians hacked us. We sort of have to figure out what the American response is. But I think the real answer lies in the fact that this isn't a uniquely American event. This is directed not just at America, it's directed at the West, and the West as a unit needs to respond.
Ilan Berman of the American Foreign Policy Council and editor of The Logic of Irregular War, Asymmetry and America's Adversaries, worth twice the price. Ilan, thank you so very much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.